At the core of Gabor Maté's compelling body of work on addiction is the notion that addiction is ubiquitous, has many manifestations, and cuts across all social demographics. This is in stark contrast to the popular portrayal of addiction as an affliction relegated to marginalized populations. Many of these addictions center around issues of body image and appearance, with a multi-million-dollar industry targeted at weight loss alone. As Gabor trenchantly argues, the compulsion to change our bodies, and in fact all addictions, have their source in feelings and beliefs of unworthiness, inadequacy, and self-loathing, to name but a few, that we internalize and come to identify with as small children. From the crack-addicted HIV sufferer in the downtown East Side to the affluent philanthropist from West Vancouver, we are all the same in this regard. And yet, it is in this very sameness, Gabor argues, that we can find hope of relief from our addictions and afflictions by drawing on the capacity and the inner resources that we all share to heal our wounds, release our mistaken beliefs, reclaim our forgotten innocence, and learn to accept and love ourselves for who we are. Ladies and gentlemen, Gabor Maté.
Thanks, Ray and Helen. It's nice to be back here at Empower Health. Well, I don't have to tell you that rates of obesity are rising across the world. The U.S. used to lead the world, but it doesn't anymore. It's Mexico now. The result is that there's somebody in Mexico diagnosed with diabetes every 38 minutes. A new case of diabetes, apparently. China, which a few decades ago knew no obesity at all, has got a huge epidemic of childhood obesity now. All this is a wonderful byproduct of Western civilization. And the writer Tom Hartman says that culture can be healthy or toxic, nurturing or murderous. And we could see obesity and eating, emotional eating, as an individual problem, as just a bad choice that somebody makes, or some kind of genetic disease, as some people say it is. Or we could see it as a manifestation of actually a toxic culture, which is how I see it. And in fact, that happens to be the title of the book I'm currently working on, which is entitled Toxic Culture. Now, when I graduated from medical school, I thought it was a very straightforward thing. You know, you take in more calories than you expend, you're going to put on weight. It's very simple. And I thought that all people needed was, you know, the facts. So somebody overweight would come into my office, I would point out to them that the extra weight, the extra adipose or fatty tissue means now you have more blood vessels that need to be conducting the flow of blood, so that means your heart has to work harder, so now you're going to put more pressure on your heart, so on and so forth. And you just, you know, all you need to do is know this, and this will give you enough incentive to lose weight. And for some reason, nobody ever lost weight because I pointed out to them the physiological facts. And it becomes clear after a while that when it comes to eating, there's something else going on that has nothing to do with nutrition as such. I was at a restaurant last night, and I really like the food at this place. And here's what I noticed, which is typical of me, that the food arrives, and I'm already worried about what happens when it's going to be finished. I mean, I just want to really enjoy it all, but I'm thinking this enjoyment is going to finish, it's going to end. And I'm already sorry that the enjoyment is going to end, which means that even as I'm eating in the present, I'm already thinking about the future. And there's a very dysfunctional relationship that we all have to food, that many of us have to food. And actually, obesity is only a part of it. I mean, I think a lot of people have body image problems who are not at all obese. I mean, I do. I'm constantly judging my body and checking in the mirror about how big my belly happens to be that day, you know. And I've been doing this for decades. And anybody looking at me would think, here's a guy who's slim. But that's not my self-image. My self-image was set in my teenage years when I was overweight, and I've never lost that self-image. So we're struggling against, number one, the fear of loss of enjoyment. Number two, whatever our body image happens to be. It works both ways. A lot of people are overweight, don't think of themselves as being overweight. On the other hand, a lot of people who are underweight think of themselves as being totally out of control when it comes to their eating. So, in other words, we have a relationship to our bodies that is not reality-based. It's based on something else. Well, what is it based on? That's one of the things we'll be looking at today. I'm just reading a life of the Buddha. He's quite an amazing guy. And this is what I happened to read this morning or last night, so I thought this would be a great thing to start with. So the story goes that the Buddha is, established in his enlightenment practice, and he's got a body of followers, the Sangha who are his pupils and his acolytes, and some Brahmin, some priestly venerable hears about him and sends his student to check out the Buddha. Is this guy really for real? So this student watches the Buddha over several days and observes him and comes back to report to his teacher that, yeah, this guy really is the real deal. And here's what he says, amongst other things. He says, when he receives rice, he does not raise or lower the bowl or tip it forwards or backwards. He receives neither too little nor too much rice. He adds sauces in the right proportions. He does not exceed the right amount of sauce in the mouthful. He turns the mouthful over 3 or 4 times in his mouth and then swallows it. And no rice grain enter his body unmasticated. In other words, he doesn't swallow his food until he chews it. Nor does he maintain any in his mouth. This is how you tell if somebody's enlightened, you see. You just watch them eat rice. So this guy, the Buddha, is eating rice, and he chews every mouthful several times, and he chews everything before he swallows it, and he doesn't take another bite till all the stuff that he's just chewed is actually swallowed. Now, enlightenment is so simple, you see. I mean, how many of you have ever eaten like that, even once? That present to what you're doing. He's not worried about, oh my God, the meal's going to be over in 5 minutes, and I'm going to then, no longer be experiencing these pleasurable sensations. He's just doing it in the moment. He takes his food experiencing the taste without experiencing greed for the taste. So he's just experiencing it in the moment, but he's not saying, how can I hold on to this? How can I get more? The food he takes has 5 factors. It is neither for amusement nor for intoxication. So it's not about having a good time, and it's not about soothing anything. It's not about killing the pain. Nor is it for smartening, nor for embellishing, but only for the endurance and continuance of the body. In other words, he eats for the purpose that food was given to us for, which is to sustain the body. I mean, when you look at the culture that we have today, I mean, who in their right minds 30 years ago would have predicted that there's going to be a food channel where it's not about food as nourishment. It's about food as diversion. It's about food as ego. It's about food as entertainment. It's about food as titillation. It's about food as a contest of skill. Nothing to do with what food is actually for. He's not using it for the ending of discomfort. I'm sorry, he's using it for the endurance and continuance of the body, for the ending of discomfort, which is to say the satiation of hunger, and for assisting the holy life. In other words, food actually has a spiritual purpose in his life. Now that's one way to be, which is precisely what we as a society don't understand anything about. And so that's how the Buddha ate, and that's how this young priest observed him to be an enlightened one. So when you look at our relationship to food in our society. What is it actually all about? Well, whether we're looking at people that eat too much, or whether we're looking at people who starve themselves, we just say anorexics. So you got both ends of the eating spectrum, if you will. But really, they're both at the same end of the spectrum, because their relationship to food is actually determined by suffering. So their relationship to food is in some way to not to deal with suffering, but to transcend it. A friend of mine, a physician in the States, a colleague I should say, but he's sort of a friend, his name is Dr. Vincent Felitti, and he's an internal medicine specialist in San Diego, and he was working at a food clinic, at least an obesity clinic, and they found at this clinic that they could successfully help people lose weight by rigorous dietary control. But what couldn't they do you imagine? They couldn't help them keep it off. People kept putting it back on and putting it back on. And Felitti finally did something quite extraordinary for a physician. He actually listened to his patients. And what they told him was, well, I'll read you what he says. Here we unexpectedly discovered that histories of childhood sexual abuse were common, as were histories of growing up in markedly dysfunctional households. It became evident that traumatic life experiences during childhood and adolescence were far more common in an obese population than was comfortably recognized. We slowly discovered that major weight loss is often sexually or physically threatening, and that obesity, whatever its health risks, is protective emotionally. In other words, what Felitti discovered about food addiction is that it wasn't the fundamental problem. It was actually the person's attempt to solve a problem. The problem that arose out of early childhood trauma. This, of course, this observation led to the very famous adverse childhood experiences studies, the ACE studies, where they looked at a large population in the Kaiser Permanente system. Kaiser Permanente is a big insurer and health provider in the States. They looked at 17,000 or 14 to 17,000 adults, and they elicited a history of childhood, and they found there were 10 categories of childhood adverse experience, and they were, if I can remember them all, physical or sexual or emotional abuse, neglect, a parent dying, a parent being jailed, violence in the family, a parent being addicted, a divorce, addiction in the family, mental illness in one of the parents. For each of these adverse childhood experiences, the risk of obesity goes up exponentially. Not just the risk of obesity, by the way, also the risk of addiction in general, including substance use, injection use, and so on. Also the risk of autoimmune disease, such as rheumatoid arthritis, such as scleroderma, such as multiple sclerosis. Also the risk of cancer goes up. So, in other words, the eating problems seem to be on a spectrum of responses to trauma somehow, and falling under the general rubric of addiction. Now, here's what's interesting. This information has been out for years. There's been dozens more studies showing exactly the same thing all over the place. A year ago, and don't forget, this is published, this study was done in the Kaiser Permanente system. So a year ago, this spring, I was invited to go to California, which is where these studies originate from. Felitti lives in San Diego. I was invited to go to speak to a number of Kaiser Permanente clinicians about addiction. And a month or two before the event, they phoned me and said, well, could you suggest some literature we could read on addiction? I said, surely you've heard of the adverse childhood experiences studies. Oh no, what are those? And when I actually spoke to these clinicians, half of them had heard of it, which is pretty good. Yeah. But it also shows the tremendous resistance to this kind of information, to any kind of relationship to of health problems to trauma is just difficult for the medical mind to accept. And the result is that all these problems, like obesity, is seen as a mechanical problem of people, as I thought of it when I finished medical school, people eating more than they burn up, that's all. That's the only problem. But as to what drives people to do that, that never occurred to me in the beginning, and it certainly doesn't occur to a lot of clinicians today either. As a matter of fact, there was an article in the New York Times just in the last year that quite a few doctors actually discriminate against obese people. They're just not comfortable with them. They don't want them in their offices. Which is interesting, and what does that tell us about the medical mind? Well, I can come to that later. But you saw what happened with Rob Ford last year. Now, Rob Ford is the mayor of Toronto, who turns out is a cocaine addict. Now he's turned out to have cancer as well. And he's been significantly overweight for many years. All you have to do is look at the guy, you know he's a traumatized person, in absolute denial of his trauma. This is why, if you want to deny trauma, go into politics. And then you get to be prime minister. Well, think about it. Think about it. I mean, if you actually look at our prime minister, first of all, he's got a weight problem. He's always fighting the bulge, the battle of the bulge. He's always up against that. Secondly, if you look in that guy's eyes, what do you actually see? Nothing. Now, how does somebody end up with nothing in their eyes? It's an emotional shutdown in the face of trauma is what that is. All you have to do is look at Harper. And if his policies weren't so destructive, it's very difficult for me to work up any kind of compassion for him just because I'm so upset by what he does in this world. But on an individual level, here's a traumatized being. And those dead eyes of his, they're the dead giveaway, if you want to put it that way, of trauma. And so Ford, who then becomes this bombastic pseudo-populist mayor and is addicted to cocaine or whatever he uses and drinks and overeats, then becomes a laughingstock. And so he goes on all these, and he's so unaware that he actually, and he wants the attention so badly that he goes on all these American laugh shows and allows himself to be made a total fool of, so that, you know, there's a skit about him on Saturday Night Live even. You know, now this is the height of fame. This is as high as you can get in our society, that somebody laughs at you on Saturday Night Live. So he becomes a joke. And what we're not realizing is we're actually laughing at human suffering. We're actually laughing at human suffering. Now, if you look at the obesity epidemic amongst children, for example, yes. The more sedentary the parents are, the more likely the obese the kid will be. The more junk food the parents eat, the more likely the kid is going to be obese. But the harsher the parents are, also the more likely to be the kid is to be obese. And there's an article, it says there, an article I've collected a whole bunch of articles on eating because I'm writing this book. New research suggests that authoritarian parenting style is worse for children's weight than an authoritative one. The study of 37,000 Canadian children found that those of authoritarian parents were 30% more likely to be obese at 2 to 5 years old. So the Tiger Mom, which again, like, is a huge deal, the Tiger Mom, I don't know how many millions of copies that book sold, it's absolutely toxic, vicious stuff, because it's basically anti-child. And the Tiger Mom is going to create more obesity, actually. Why? Because human beings have a fundamental need, and that fundamental need is basically to be loved. And being loved doesn't just mean that parents feel love for you. The parents feeling love for you does not mean that you're going to experience being loved. A lot of parents love their kids. I mean, I loved my kids, but that doesn't mean that my kids experience being loved. I mean, I loved them particularly when they were asleep, you know, and next morning, you know, but it's next morning that they need to feel the love, not when they're sleeping. And that means being accepted and valued and celebrated and enjoyed for who they are. That's the nourishing thing that kids need. And fundamentally, anytime that need is frustrated, whether because people are traumatized and abused or neglected, or whether the parents are too distracted or too depressed to meet the child's needs, that child is going to be short of a fundamental nourishing experience that they will then spend the rest of their lives trying to compensate for. One way to compensate for it is through oral soothing. I mean, what do you do with babies when they're crying? We stick a nipple in their mouths. If the kid is lucky, it'll be a real nipple. If the kid is not lucky, it'll be a plastic nipple. But clearly, oral intake and being soothed by a caring person are very closely associated in the mind. So what this is all about is self-nourishing. So anytime somebody's got a dysfunctional relationship to food, it fundamentally means that they have a dysfunctional relationship to themselves, and they're trying to soothe themselves. Now, typically, when do people do that? When they're stressed. So if any of you, you know, like I don't have an obesity problem, but I'm also quite compulsive about how I relate to food and exercise and all that. And it's not a bad thing, but it's not an easy relationship necessarily. And I can tell you just from my own experience that when am I more likely to cram down some junk food, it's precisely when I'm stressed. Because the junk foods actually release hormones and substances in the brain that soothe stress. So it's not that we have an obesity epidemic in our culture, we have a stress epidemic in our culture. And a lot of people are relating to that by soothing themselves with the junk foods. And the food companies, of course, know very well how to exploit that. I mean, they just know how to do that. I mean, there was a book last year called Sugar, Fat, and Salt or something like that. That was the title. And the author found that the food companies, Kellogg and Kraft and all these, with their wonderful ads, you know. My God, talk about ads. I was in Colombia, Bogota. I'll come back to this point in a moment. But I was in Bogota, Colombia, 10 days ago. And Bogota is the capital of Colombia, and it's got this plaza, Simón Bolívar Plaza. Simón Bolívar was the liberator of Latin America from the Spanish. And so there's a square named after him with a statue. And on this giant square, which is Bogota's main square, there was a demonstration being held. And what we heard was a loud megaphone, amplified voice, talking about Coca-Cola. And there were 5 people on stage. 4 of them wore masks, so they didn't want to be identified by the police. And these were Coca-Cola workers that were protesting the policies of Coca-Cola, which are murderous. So people that try to organize unions in the Coca-Cola factory in Bogota, they're likely to be tortured and jailed and so on. And these people were brave enough to hold a demonstration against that. There was nobody there. Nobody was there to demonstrate. Bogota is a city of 7 million people. People were either indifferent, too beaten down by the system, or too afraid to show up for the demonstration. And I'm thinking about advertising here because you all know that beautiful ad. I love to buy the world a Coke. And how does it go? Something about love, right? Isn't it? What's the line?
I'd like to buy the world a
Coke and
keep it company.
right?
Social harmony.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is loving Coca-Cola. So these companies just know how to get at us you know, and McDonald's has been, for years, the advertising appeals to what? People's need for family contact. So the family's all discombobulated and stressed, and they go to McDonald's and, oh, now we can be together as a loving family. And those same companies know exactly how to create the foods, and they do this very consciously. They study this in a laboratory. This is not random. They do this with test tubes and instruments and machines and calibrations and every kind of technology, how to find just the right combination of salt, sugar, and fat that will release the endorphins in your brain that'll make you addicted to that food. So the companies very well know how to exploit all that, and they do that mercilessly, but they don't create the need. They don't create the need. Interesting enough, there's a wonderful writer from Uruguay, Eduardo Galeano, who just died last week. And I heard an interview with him that was done sometime before his death, and Galeano talked about the great boon that the McDonald's company wanted to bestow upon the Bolivian people. So they opened 8 outlets or something. But the Bolivian people just didn't know how to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity. They really preferred to hold on to their traditional foods. So they had to close the outlets, you know, and these ingrates, the Bolivians, you know. But that's because in that culture, they still have enough of their own stuff and their and healthy contacts that they don't need to soothe themselves with the junk food that McDonald's very graciously would try to foist upon them. But in our society, we've lost that. I mean, the family is broken down. We don't have meals together anymore. It's interesting, if you look at Spain, for example, Spanish food is very fatty. They eat a lot of meat over there. But you hardly see any obesity in Spain. Why? Because, first of all, people take a long time over their meals. There's none of this. See, this doesn't satisfy you. This doesn't satisfy you. For satisfaction of food, you have to actually enjoy it. You have to spend time over it, like the Buddha, chew every bite. And then swallow the next, and then take the next one. When in Spain, they take time over their food. It's a social thing, so they get nourished. Emotionally, they get nourished. If you go to Spain, many restaurants are closed for lunch. Can you believe that? Restaurant closed for lunch? Because they're having their feast and their siesta with their families. And they don't snack between meals. They don't have to be constantly trying to satisfy themselves orally. So it's not even the type of food so much as just the relationship to the food that creates the problem or avoids the problem. So in our society, food, because of the breakdown of emotional nourishment, food has become the substitute. And not to mention that because when people lack mastery in their lives, when they feel that they don't exercise real power over their lives, well then you'll move towards activities where you can have some power. And you can really be the creator, you know? So when you start fiddling with food in a creative way, you're the creator, right? Well, that's okay. It's even a part of human life. But why is it so important? It's so important because we lack that capacity to create in so many aspects of our lives. So food becomes a substitute again for something that's much more important. At the other end of the behavioral spectrum, but not of the trauma spectrum, you've got anorexia or bulimia. Now, again, I've never met an anorexic or bulimic who was not a traumatized person. And what you've got in anorexia is fundamentally, I think, a person who is desperately trying to exert some control over themselves, and that's the only thing they can control, is what's going to enter their orifices. So, and it's also a way of resisting That's the one thing the parents can't control, is how you're going to eat. Or whether you go to the bathroom afterwards and you throw up. And that bulimic urge, from people that I've talked to, it's got an addictive quality to it. There's the buildup of tension, the anticipation, and then the release, which is the same in any addictive behavior. And then you have the shame that follows, which is also what happens in any addictive behavior. So whether we're looking at overeating or rigid, self-destructive undereating, we're looking at responses to trauma in the past. And what we're looking at in the present is an excess of stress that we haven't found a way to deal with. So that it's not a question of bad habits, it's a question of how do we deal with the stresses in our lives. And a lot of us, you know, if I find my stress relief through shopping, well, I mean, that's not going to show up on my body. It might show up in my bank account, but it's not going to show up in my body. If I find it through exercise, I might even have a body that people envy. But of course, I can have an addictive relationship to exercise too. I mean, anybody can. It's not the behavior. It's never the behavior, by the way, that tells you whether it's addictive or not. It's your relationship to it. So any behavior that has craving, pleasure, and relief associated with it in the short term, but negative consequences in the long term, negative consequences in the long term, and you can't give it up, that's an addiction. So you can have you can see two people jogging in the street. One of them is perfectly healthy. They're just jogging because they want to stay healthy. And the other could be totally addicted to the exercise. How can you tell? You can't by looking at them. You'd have to know something about their internal dynamics in their lives. Because one of them may be doing it as a way of not dealing with issues in their lives, as a way of getting away from intimate relationships, as a way of diverting themselves from their emotional distress. And so these days you have a lot of people engaged in supposedly healthy activities, but in a completely unhealthy way. The only difference is that with, you know, when you've got a food issue and you're acting it out, it's going to show up either in the form of excess weight or underweight. Or there's a lot of people with perfectly normal body shapes up there who are hiding a very dysfunctional relationship to food. They just manage to compensate for it in other ways. So again, it's not a matter of quantities ultimately or habits. It's a question of what is the intention or what is the unconscious intention behind the eating. And of course, study after study, child maltreatment increases the risk of adult obesity, child abuse linked with food addiction in adult women, on and on and on. Then of course we come to genes. So in our society, we like to explain things by genetic reasons. So that, you know, if, addiction, for example, you know, the American Society of Addiction Medicine defines addiction as a primary brain disease, about 50% determined by genetics. This is the official medical view of addiction. It's total nonsense. If it's 5%, I'd be surprised. But there's something comforting about explaining things by genetic causation, because we don't have to look at people's pain. We don't have to look at people's trauma. We don't have to look at social toxicity. We can just put it down to genes. Well, there are genes that are implicated in obesity. Like there's a certain gene that if you have, you're more likely to be overweight, but only since the Second World War. People with the same gene before the war had no problem with it. Why? Because there wasn't so much junk food around. So that, again, the gene is not causing the obesity. It's the need to soothe yourself with junk food that's causing the obesity. It's just that if you have the gene, you're going to be more likely to pack on the weight. But the gene is not causing you to be obese, which is incidentally true of most genes when it comes to most diseases too. There are some genes that will directly cause disease, but they're relatively rare. As to why we have such a problem with understanding this very simple fact, why people aren't helped more to come to terms with their trauma when it comes to their eating issues, the doctors who are kind of the gatekeepers to health care just don't understand trauma, and they don't want to. As to why not, well, I think before you can deal with somebody else's pain, you have to be comfortable with your own. And a lot of people go into high-powered professions precisely because they don't want to deal with their pain. They want to control it in other people, but they don't want to deal with it in themselves. Therefore, they can't confront it, the cause of it, in anybody else either. Which is why you can go to a rheumatologist. I can tell you, for example, if any of you have an autoimmune illness here, anybody? Rheumatoid arthritis, what do you got? Yeah, you want to say? Psoriasis. Psoriasis, okay. And you? Yeah, rosacea. Rosacea? Okay. Anybody ever ask you about your childhood? In the doctor's office?
No.
No.
Okay. Stresses? How you relate to yourself? No. Any of that? But psoriasis and rosacea are both stress-driven and trauma-driven diseases, conditions. To one degree or another. And it's the body's way of reacting to stress. Incidentally, how do we treat these conditions? What kind of cream did they give you? Steroid cream. Cortisol cream. What is cortisol? It's a stress hormone. It never occurs to us. We're treating all these conditions, rheumatoid arthritis, scleroderma, multiple sclerosis, eczema, psoriasis, with stress hormones. You think that there's a simple light would go up in the mind that says, my gosh, I'm going to give high quantities of stress hormone to treat these conditions. Is it possible that this condition is any way related to stress? It's just like, she's like such an obvious question. But it doesn't occur. And I was lecturing to medical students today at UBC, and I know that in 4 years, the only lecture they've ever had on stress, trauma, and all that would have been the one they heard today from me. And so no wonder then that, you know, you walk into the average health caregiver's office, you're just not going to be helped to understand yourself. Now, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us, basically, I say to people, this is why there's a place like Empower Health. I say to people, well, okay, so what are you complaining for? So your doctor didn't talk to you about stress. Well, if you go to the butcher store, do you expect to buy cookies? No. What do you expect to buy at the butcher? I expect to buy meat or fish. Great. So when you go to the butcher store, don't ask for cookies. They don't have any. When you go to the bakery, don't ask for a cut of sirloin. They're not going to have it. When you go to the doctor's office, don't ask for stuff they can't know how to give you. They know certain things to do, and they can be very helpful. Go for it. But if you want other kind of help, go to a different place. So first of all, we have to broaden our sense of what constitutes health care. So even the phrase complementary medicine or alternative treatment drives me crazy. Alternative to what? It's like there's the standard, which is the mainstream medical model, which has got fantastic triumphs. I'm far from blind to the amazing things that we can do as physicians, but at the same time, it's a very narrow range of things that we can deal with. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, well, here's a study. Guess what they found out after 2,500 years? There's an article from the New York Times called Better Eating Through Mindfulness. Research is amazing. They're always finding out that the wheel is round, you know. That the rain is wet, all this kind of stuff, you know. It drives me nuts. There was an article last year. I wrote my book on addiction. It was published in 2008, you know. And it's all about trauma, right? It's not even controversial if you look at the research. There was a study out of England last year or the year before. It said some university researchers found out that there may be a relationship between childhood trauma and addiction. More research is needed. Well, no, you don't need any more research. We already know this stuff. You guys just haven't read the literature because you're up in your ivory towers and you have no idea what reality actually is all about. And you've never talked to an addicted person in your life. You just read papers. So we're always doing this amazing research that, that tells us what we already know. So in this particular case, I mean, this is good because if people don't know it, they should know it. Researchers are learning that teaching obese individuals mindful eating skills, I mean, this is really deep stuff, like paying closer attention to their body's hunger cues and learning to savor their food can help them change unhealthy eating patterns and lose weight. And unlike other forms of treatment, mindfulness may get at the underlying causes of overeating, like craving, stress, and emotional eating, which make it so hard to defeat. And so, yeah, when somebody comes to me and they want a treatment for smoking, I don't tell them to stop smoking. You know what I tell them to do? I tell them to smoke mindfully. The next time you light a cigarette, don't just do it mindlessly. Don't just do it as a by-the-by along with some other activity. Stop. Go outside and say, right now I'm feeling so harassed and so stressed that I need the soothing that the cigarette's going to offer me. And take your time lighting the cigarette and savor every puff and let it go through your lungs and enjoy it as you breathe it in and out and just really groove on what it's doing for you. Do it mindfully. The same with food. There's no point telling people to eat less. They tried so many times. But tell them to eat mindfully. It turns out that if you eat mindfully, 4 raisins are as satisfying as a whole box of raisins, because they last just as long as ordinarily. If you eat the raisins like this, well, if you're going to spend 20 seconds eating raisins, then spend 20 seconds eating 4 raisins, chewing each one, and swirling it around your mouth and really enjoying it. So do it mindfully. Then you actually start noticing what is it that the raisins are doing for you and why you wanted to eat it. So I'm certainly not saying I have an answer to anybody. This is a highly individual question, and I think if people really want to deal with their eating issues, they have to deal with the underlying traumas and the underlying stresses that are driving it. In other words, not make it into a mechanical food problem, but really see that it's their attempt to solve a problem in their lives, like Dr. Felitti says, and be very, very mindful about it. Now, it's probably true that the people who are driven to overeat, there's something different about their brains. But that's true about addicts in general. In other words, the reward centers in the brain are probably under-functioning. So you need more stimulation to set up the reward apparatus in your brain. Why is that? That's because under conditions of early stress and trauma, the reward apparatus doesn't develop properly. So you probably have fewer dopamine receptors, fewer endorphin receptors, and so on, which means you need more stimulation to satisfy those circuits. But that can also be overcome with time. The brain does have the capacity to develop new circuits, and that takes mindful attention, and it takes some loving care towards yourself. You need to actually give yourself the attention that you never got as a kid, and that'll actually help to rewire your brain. But it can all be done, but it can't be done as a simple health problem or a mechanical problem. It really needs to be seen in the context of your whole life. Now, typically, and I've seen this over and over again, a woman is in a difficult, stressful relationship with a guy. She leaves the relationship, she loses weight. Not because she becomes desperately self-denying, but because she's not so stressed anymore, and she's no longer having to soothe herself. And then she goes back into the relationship, and the weight goes back on again. So I'm not saying don't be in relationship, but be in relationship mindfully, so that you don't have to turn to food to soothe the stresses that are created for you by the relationship. I think that kind of sums up what I have to tell you. And we have time for a conversation, which is actually, for me, more interesting than listening to any more to myself. So, any questions? Yeah, go ahead. Sarah. Sarah, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm curious about what you think about this fairly new, they haven't formalized a diagnostic criteria yet on orthorexia.
On what?
Orthorexia, it's this
Ortho.
new disorder of a fear of clean eating. Or a fear, sorry, of like an obsession with clean eating and a fear of food in general.
You know what? I haven't heard of it yet. But why not? I mean, they're discovering new stuff all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, all that's really happening is that people are, the same anxieties are pouring into new vessels. And then we think we have a new disease. We don't. We just have a new form of response to trauma. So I don't know what to think of that, except to say that it's, I wouldn't be surprised if I looked at the people who are diagnosed with it, that they have the same traumas as everybody else.
I guess what I like about the idea of the diagnosis is that we have so many people in society who are still so focused on the mainstream and who only seem to pay attention if something is brought up in the mainstream. And I think it is a real problem. We have a lot of women in particular now who are absolutely afraid of food. And
Afraid of food?
anything in their mouth that isn't
Not organic.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's all part of the same issue.
Yeah.
I just think if there was a diagnosis, maybe it would help to bring some awareness to some of the people in
Okay.
that are so focused on mainstream medicine.
Okay. Okay.
Epidemic. Orthorexia is epidemic amongst naturopathic doctors.
Orthorexia. Orthorexia. And orthorexia means that you can only have certain kind of foods.
It becomes like when you learn so much about what's healthy and what's
Yeah.
not. It's like the gluten-free, sugar-free,
Yeah.
free,
Yeah.
you know, diet. Yeah, I think that's
Well, okay, but what is it? What is it really? It's a fear, and it's probably. I mean, it's probably a direct response to trauma in the sense that something's entering your body that it's going to damage you. That usually means that something already did. Yeah. Any other questions? Go ahead, yes, please.
Are there certain healthy foods that help build dopamine and
Healthy foods that build dopamine? That's probably better asked of my naturopathic friends. I'm not a nutritionist, you know, and I just don't know the answer. Is there an answer to that?
yes, it's more based on the picture of the individual, patient in front of you, because it's a lot to do with actually getting adequate nutrients in, right? But then also when you eat and eating regularly, and so there's a lot more to it than just the type of foods, but yeah.
I know one thing, this doesn't answer your question, but in Mexico, for example, where obesity is going up and up and up, the corn that they eat now, as a result of the multinationals and a free trade agreement, they no longer eat that healthy, home-ground corn that kept them very healthy, basically. And now they're genetically modified and diluted of nutriments. So for sure there are foods that are good for you. I'm just not a trained nutritionist. Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about mindfulness as a way to help approach these issues. I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner.
Great,
so
okay.
We work with the nervous system. I don't know if you can say anything to talking about the underlying nervous system dysregulation that can actually make mindfulness really impossible for some traumatized individuals.
Right, well, why don't you say something about it?
Okay, sure.
Are you talking about Peter Levine's thing?
Yeah.
You know, Peter and I are writing my next book together.
Yeah.
Yeah. But go on, say something about
Well, there's a lot of activation in the nervous system. People are going to have trouble even being mindful because there's too much chaos on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
So without addressing the nervous system first and sort of establishing the
Yeah.
safety, safety in the system,
Right.
so that things can start to have a bit more space, so that some of the charge can start to come out. I get frustrated when I only hear about mindfulness,
Mm-hmm.
when it doesn't address how so many people can't do that skill.
Right. Fair enough. That reminds me of a conversation I had with Bessel van der Kolk, who's another trauma expert, and him and I were presenting at a conference in New York, and sitting at a table with a bunch of people, and people were talking about how, things to pay attention to the breath, but somebody at the table made the same point, that people who've been traumatized, the breath actually makes them totally anxious.
Yeah.
So somebody said, better the butt than the breath.
Yeah.
So, if you can't pay attention to your butt,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's better than the breath for some people.
Yeah.
So you got to really get into the body.
And that's the real point, is it's so individual, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you can't apply one solution to a mass of people,
Right.
because we're all so different and unique in our responses.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you. So I've heard many of your talks and I've read your books, and I'm curious about one thing, is that given all the different addictions that we all know have the same base,
Yeah.
and the base being trauma and all, and that need to fulfill something, so whether it's a work addiction or something that's actually maybe rewarded in society,
Mhm.
or something, as what
Mhm.
we're talking about tonight. To me, it seems like it's almost impossible in the world that we live in that somebody actually does not have an addiction.
Mhm.
And so when you talk about these studies, they say the addicted versus they found that 30% have these addictions. So what does it look like for people who, what do lives of people who are not addicted actually look like?
Go to the rainforest and find out.
Because these studies are done in Western, a lot of them are done in the Western countries, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, because if it's 30%, well, what does the other 70% look like? How are they living?
Well, here's the problem. Listen, Paula, you're quite right. I mean, there's hardly anybody in our society that in some way that escapes completely. There's hardly anybody, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, and the studies don't even get at all the trauma, because you can ask people, what happened? Were you sexually abused, neglected? Did your father die? Did your parents get a divorce? Incidentally, parents, when there's marriage strife, the kids are more likely to be abused, by the way. You can ask them these questions. But these studies, what they don't take into account is kids who weren't traumatized overtly, but who just didn't get their needs met. So there's something called developmental trauma that has nothing to do with bad stuff happening, it just has to do with good stuff not happening.
Which isn't in the ACE study, though.
Which, sorry?
That's not in the
It's not in the ACE study because they don't know about that. Yeah. I've talked to Felipe about that, and he doesn't quite get it.
It's one of the hugest things.
Yeah.
That's the thing that all of us almost.
Absolutely, and they don't talk about it, and it's hard to study what didn't happen.
Yeah.
If you were you sexually abused, yes or no? It's either yes or you weren't. Were you hit? Either yes or you weren't hit.
Yeah.
But what didn't happen, which is that getting that nourishing, attuned attention, that's much more difficult to study, and people aren't quite attuned to that particular question. But as to what a non-addicted person looks like, well, let me read you what let me read you what a non-addicted. Let me read you what a non-addicted person looks like, okay? This is out of a book called Memoirs of an Addicted Brain by a neuroscientist called Mark Lewis. And Lewis himself talks about his own addictions and the brain physiology of addiction and all that. But he describes what happens when he goes to Malaysia and he comes across some Aboriginal people, including a father and a son, standing on a forest path. And I'm going to read you this description, if I can find it. Here it is. Just before reaching the highlands, almost desperate now for a shower and a normal meal, I met a pair of Orang Asli, who's Aboriginal tribe, who looked just like they just stepped out of a time machine. I was ahead of the others, so I was the first to see them. A man and a boy of 10 or 12, father and son, I was sure. They stood so still that I almost bumped into them, and my first reaction was fear. The man had a blowgun by his side. It was long as he was tall, and I knew it was equipped with a poison-tipped dart. He held it casually, upright beside him. He wore only a loincloth. The boy was completely naked. We gaped at each other, maybe just for a minute, but it seemed much longer. The man looked strong, confident, and proud. Not the kind of proud that comes from collected accomplishments, but the kind that comes from being completely at home in the world. His smile was magnificent. He seemed to revel in this unfathomable moment. There was nothing he needed to say or do. Now, have you ever felt there's nothing you needed to say or do? Ever? Have I? But the boy's expression and stance was even more remarkable. He regarded me with a face so open, so unclouded, that it seemed to lie outside the repertoire of the human. His eyes were a window between his body and the world outside him, uninterrupted by the opacity of the self. Get that? Uninterrupted by the opacity of the self. Not an atom of self-consciousness, not a hint of anxiety, no shyness, no attempt to please. For days I tried to understand what I had seen in this boy, and bit by bit it came to me. He knew himself instinctively, without a self-image to maintain and adjust, without norms or standards by which to evaluate himself. He felt exactly what it was like to be at home in himself. And for this I envied him enormously, because no matter how hard I tried, and despite my additional years, I couldn't find myself, couldn't know myself, not like that. All I could find was a collection of evaluations, and so on. You know, but at least he says, I was grateful to have witnessed this because I see that I know that it's possible. That's from a book called Memoirs of an Addicted Brain by Mark Lewis. Now, there's a researcher, a psychologist, I believe, a neuroscientist actually, called Darcy Narvaez at Notre Dame University, who studied what the optimal parenting environment is, and she found that the optimal parenting environment is actually the hunter-gatherer tribe, precisely the grouping that this man and his son came from. So yeah, it's possible to be a human being and be comfortable in your own skin, but I don't know if it's possible for a lot of us in our society. I think you'd have to be very, very fortunate, or you have to be doing a lot of work to get to the point of comfort in our own skin, which is our birthright. Yeah.
I want to ask you a question, just like personally, like I know you with the line of work you do, and just what's your personal opinion about society and where that is going in the future with all this discussion, like, you know,
Okay.
the hunter-gatherer, and then how we have our society. Do you feel like we will move into that direction? Or do you feel
Well, actually it's getting worse. It's actually getting worse. But, I mean, because it's getting worse, it's also getting better, because the worse it gets, the more people wake up. And in my next book, as I said, it's called Toxic Culture. That's what I think about our society. It's a toxic culture. It makes people sick. And here's what Eric Fromm, who's a social psychologist who lived in the first half of the 20th century and wrote a book called, he wrote a number of books, including, it's called The Sane Society. And I just want to find a quote by him, where he says, the fact that millions of people share the same vices does not make these vices virtues. The fact that they share so many of the same errors does not make these errors to be truths. And the fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make these people sane. And then he defines health, and here's what he says. I mean, to answer your question about society, he says, this is I just finished the first 2 chapters of my book, and so I'm quoting from here. It says, mental health cannot be defined in terms of the adjustment of the individual society, but on the contrary, it must be defined in terms of the adjustment of society to the needs of man. And the same with physical health. So rather than see it as an individual thing, is how does society adjust to the needs of the members of the society? Well, if you ask the question, how does this society adjust to the needs of its members? I go back to that quote by Tom Hartman, who says, culture can be healthy or toxic, nurturing or murderous. This is a toxic culture. Now, because of its very toxicity, more people are being forced to wake up. So we've got that now. A lot of people asking questions, looking for alternatives. But that's because it's got so dysfunctional. Sorry? Noam Chomsky, when he was asked if he's an optimist or a pessimist, he said that strategically I'm an optimist and tactically I'm a pessimist. So it's going to get worse before it gets better. That's what I think. Yeah. Yeah.
When the Addiction Center in Squamish was being renamed after Deepak Chopra, he said something that I found very interesting. I wanted to comment on it. He said that, in his opinion, alcohol and drug abuse very often is a form of attempt to have a spiritual experience. And if people are taught or find different ways to have spiritual experience, not only they deal with their addictions or they don't have addictions anymore, that become more kind, compassionate human beings than those who never went through that traumatic experience.
Okay. So Deepak says that addictions, alcohol, substance use, it's an attempt at a spiritual experience. Yeah. So he would say that. Because he's another one that doesn't want to look at trauma too much. You know? But that doesn't mean there isn't truth in what he says. Because when you actually look at what is it the addict wants, what the addict wants is a sense of completion, of being whole. And I know from my own addictive behaviors that there's a moment when you actually feel whole. When do you feel whole? When you don't need anything. When you're not craving anything. And there's a brief moment, just as you've indulged, when you truly feel, this is it. This is the last one. I don't need anything anymore. And that moment you feel complete. That completeness is our spiritual birthright. And I believe, this is how I understand what he's saying. Now, I don't really think that the addict uses, the guy in the downtown east side or the person, for that matter, in Shaughnessy who has another drink. He's not saying to themselves, my God, I want to be at one with the universe. Like, they're not consciously looking for a spiritual experience, but they are looking for the essence of it, which is completion. And where you really don't need. Zorba the Greek said, I'm not afraid of anything, I don't need anything, I'm free. So we're looking for that freedom, and that freedom is a spiritual quality. So I think that's he's right. But I think he skips the stage, which is the stage of trauma.
In your experience, is it true, though, that if people find different ways to experience the spiritual experience, that they will?
It's not true because as soon as you say to yourself that I need to have this experience to feel complete, you're wounding yourself because you're saying that I'm not complete. So it's not possible to satiate the need for completion by not seeing your wholeness. So it's a temporary seeking of a state that resembles completion, but it's temporary. And you always need another one and another one and another one. So I think that's one of those statements that has truth in it, but I think is lacking in, personally, I think it's lacking in depth. Yeah.